Today, I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Senator Olympia Snowe. We're really looking forward to spending time with you this afternoon. Senator Snowe has a long history of service to our country and support, very strong support of women's issues. She spent 3 terms in the U.S. Senate from 95 to 2013 after having served 16 years in the House of Representatives. Prior to her congressional service, she served in the Maine state legislature. During her time in Congress, she was noted for her ability to compromise and bring both sides together. Imagine that. Having a strong, that deserves a round of applause, absolutely. She has a strong sense of bipartisanship, and in fact, in 2006, she was named one of America's best senators. The current congressional impasse led her to decide against re-election and focus on trying to repair a dysfunctional Congress. She talks about this extensively in her book entitled Fighting for Common Ground, how we can fix the stalemate in Congress. Senator Snowe also has a very compelling personal story too, one of perseverance and overcoming obstacles. She was raised by her aunt and uncle after the death of both of her parents. And her first husband, Peter Snowe, was killed in an auto accident when she was only 26 years old. She first ran for office to complete his term in the Maine House of Representatives. When first elected to Congress at the age of 31, Senator Snowe was the youngest Republican woman and the first Greek-American woman ever elected to Congress. She was also the first woman to serve in both houses of the state legislature and both houses of Congress. In addition to serving on many congressional committees, including the first woman to serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee, of important note to us today, she co-chaired the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues for more than 10 years, making her an outstanding choice to speak to us today. Senator Snowe is a role model for many, including me, particularly those, and we hope she continues to serve as a role model to those who have come behind her in Congress. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Senator Olympia Snowe.
Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much, Jennifer, for the very gracious introduction. I truly appreciate it, and I appreciate being here today and this warm response. And in exchange, I will follow the advice given to me by a very wise person who said, Olympia, a great speech is one with a good beginning and a good ending, which are kept very close together. So I'm going to try to do that. But I do want to say a good beginning would be for me to express my sincere appreciation to Jennifer for those very generous words of introduction, and most especially for bringing her considerable talents and depth of experience, not only as the Chief Human Resource Officer at Duke Energy, but also here to this formidable summit. So we thank you. And I also want to add my voice of thanks to Duke Energy for supporting this summit from the very beginning, and to all of the sponsors who made it possible. It truly is a privilege for me to be here today, which I understand is the 3rd of the annual summits, because you should be immensely proud of what you've been able to accomplish, that this Women and Girls Research Alliance is on a campus at UNC Charlotte that is enormously respected and highly esteemed, and that it is tied so meaningfully to the community and to the region, that is benefiting the students and obviously benefiting the entire state of North Carolina. And in that regard, I would like to also recognize Chancellor Dubois and his dynamic wife, Lisa. First of all, to Lisa, and thanking her for being at the forefront, of this summit and the auspicious inception of the alliance as well. As I understand, she chaired the first summit, and she also chaired the very first steering committee. So I want to congratulate you for being at the forefront of those efforts, Lisa. And Chancellor Dubois, besides adding diversity to this audience, let me also express my gratitude on the remarkable record of innovative and visionary leadership that you have established here at the UNC Charlotte and the entire University of North Carolina system, which is phenomenal. I think that is certainly illustrative in all of the capital improvements that you were describing that are occurring here on this campus, but also illustrative and I think demonstrative of your level of performance and standards that it's resulted in a 28% increase in enrollment. And I think that speaks volumes about the success of your stewardship of this university. So we thank you as well. And I couldn't help but think when the Chancellor was talking about their marriage, Lisa and Phil's, I was thinking about my husband. When my husband and I got married, he was the governor of Maine and I was in the U.S. House of Representatives. And I received this card from a friend. And on the front of the card it said, the 3 most important words in a marriage are, and you open it up and said, "That's right, dear." And my husband did a very good job in following that advice. Of course, they asked him if I was going to be I was always asked if I was going to be changing my name, and he would be asked the same question. He said, no. He said, I'm keeping my name. I also want to convey my gratitude as well to your chair-elect, Gina Esquivel, and to your dual co-directors, Lisa and Susan Jeton, Lisa Yarrow and Susan Jeton. This is a trio and certainly a voice to be reckoned with, and so we want to thank them as well for their contributions to this summit and to the overall alliance. And so it is a pleasure to be here today, and the company is such thoughtful, forward-looking, reasonable-minded people. Not that Washington isn't brimming with such individuals these days, but I do want to underscore the importance, and you can't overstate it, the role that the Women's and Girls Research Alliance plays in improving the lives of women and girls through research, through education, through civic engagement. You're the linchpin for progress by focusing your efforts on vital issues such as homelessness and its implication for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg region, as well as the much-discussed wage gap between men and women, and defining poverty and its impact on the greater community as well. You are on the vanguard, of progress, without question, because of the positive changes that you bring about day in and day out with credible, nonpartisan research and analysis that helps to develop public policy, and also it helps to solve problems. Facts matter, unbelievably as it may sound today, given the environment in Washington and our political system, but facts matter. They're crucial, they're foundational, and they're fundamental. They're fundamental to the critical resources and limited resources that we have to shape public policy and to provide services. It matters to those who receive those critical services. It matters to those that want economic equality and opportunity. It matters for shaping the policy and ultimately creating the results by making a difference in driving it forward and achieving a solution to the problem. The reality is that we have seen that all too often that facts fall prey to the ideological and partisan warfare in today's political system. The late Senator Daniel Pat Moynihan of New York once said, people are entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to the facts. He couldn't have been more right. The reality is that you're focusing on issues that aren't Democratic issues or Republican issues. They're not conservative issues. They're not liberal issues. They're moral issues. They're human issues. They're civil rights issues, and they should be addressed as such. When I was serving in the U.S. When I was serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, I and my female colleagues, to which Jennifer was referring to, yes, it was the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues, and I will discuss that in a moment. It was first known as the Congresswomen's Caucus on Women's Issues, and we changed it to Congressional Caucus so we could invite the men so they could pay dues. We needed some allies because there were so few of us. But you know, we worked on issues and we relied on organizations such as yours for the empirical data that was necessary to craft the legislation to move forward. And it was important to have credible information and data to shape our initiatives, because that was the way in which you could coalesce the support so you could make sure that your bills ultimately became law. And you know, that's the way it worked. And I know it is a surprise to some in today's environment in Washington, where you don't have that kind of legislative process because they're not using the facts, they're talking about messaging and political talking points. But it is a template to which lawmakers should return to or familiarize themselves with, because ultimately it makes a difference. The fact that your summit theme is underscoring convergence is totally appropriate. And that's exactly and precisely what you're doing through the Alliance and through the summit. You've integrated across all sectors of society and the economy, from the academic to the nonprofit, the governmental, and to the corporate, because it requires teamwork, it requires collaboration in every sphere of life. People are collaborating because it's necessary in order to be successful and to be effective and ultimately to achieve the solutions that are so important. The only sphere in which it obviously is not occurring is in the political arena, and specifically in the United States Congress, which is precisely what I want to discuss here today in conjunction with what I think is important to move forward for this country, and explaining why and what happened and that undermined our political system to the degree that it has incapacitated it from reaching solutions or to bringing people together to develop the legislation necessary to enhance the quality of life for all Americans. And what we can do, in spite of the fact that Congress has gone off track, to make our government work again. Because, frankly, there should be no mistake. The consequences of which are profound if we do not redress and remedy the problems that exist in Washington, and with the political gridlock that has grappled our nation's governing institutions, because it will dictate our very future. We cannot afford to be indifferent. We cannot afford to sit on the sidelines. And we certainly cannot afford to be like the old man that was in my story that I like to tell about a group of tourists who come across the bridge from New Hampshire into Maine, and after they cross the bridge, they face two directional signs at the intersection. One said Portland left, the other one said Portland right. Obviously confused, they decided to pull over on the side of the road, and one of the tourists rolled down the window and decided to ask a man who was standing on the side of the road, and happened to be an old Mainer, and she put the question to him. She said, "Well, sir," pointing to the signs, "does it matter which way we go to Portland?" And he paused for a moment. He said, "Not to me it don't." Well, so much like a Mainer, Well, it doesn't matter which way we go to Portland, but it does very much matter what road we take in this country. And the very course that we establish will dictate the destiny of our country. My own perspective has been etched from my 4 decades in the legislative branch of government that obviously was my life's work. It wasn't an easy decision to decide not to seek re-election for a 4th term to the United States Senate, because obviously I loved being in the Senate, I loved being the legislative branch of government. But unfortunately I came to the cold, stark reality and the conclusion that the polarization and the partisanship would not be diminished in the short term. So I departed the Senate, not because I no longer loved the institution, not because I didn't believe in its potential, but precisely because I do. I just decided to take my fight outside the institution and fight in a different direction for bipartisanship, because it would not change from within. And everywhere that I have traveled across this country, and I've literally crisscrossed our nation, I've talked to students on so many college campuses and to organizations of all political persuasions, and I'm trying to assure Americans that in spite of what the political classes and the polarizing forces would have you believe, that yes, we can bridge the political divide and we can defeat the machinery of partisanship. And that's why I decided to write a book. And believe me, that was not on my agenda when I decided not to seek re-election. Somebody once said, it's fun to have written a book, it's not fun to write a book. But in my book, I described, how Congress and the Senate specifically used to work, because it did. And what we need to do to return our system to one that had been envisioned by our founding fathers. I'm so passionate about changing the tenor of government because I've seen it to be different. I know it can be different, and it hasn't always been this way. And I can tell you that I've experienced, the process when it worked almost throughout my legislative journey. And my legislative journey began early, as Jennifer mentioned. I started in political office at the age of 26, and the circumstances were difficult because my first husband had been killed in a car accident returning home from a state legislative session. And obviously, it was a very difficult time for me. But at the same time, people were coming to me and approaching me about running for public office. They knew about my passion for politics. That obviously wasn't an ideal time in which to make that decision. But ultimately, I decided that, I was at a crossroads. I could either decide to retreat from the world or try to make a positive out of a negative. So I decided that I would run for the state legislature in a special election and then make my future decisions based on my experience. After all, I had majored in political science in college. I loved politics. I had always determined that I would do something to contribute to the world around me because I wanted to help others, and the empathy that I had developed as a result of my own personal hardship. So I was sworn into the state legislature by the governor because it was a special election at that point. And in my first hours in the state legislature, I went upstairs to the chamber, and I was standing outside the House of Representatives and looking around, seeing people that I either heard or read about, and pondering my future and my decision. When all of a sudden, I was approached by a state Senate Majority Leader, and he said, "Olympia, I know what you're thinking." And I said, "You do?" He said, "Yes, I do." He said, "You're looking around the chamber wondering how you got here." He said, "But I can assure you in a few months that you will be looking around this chamber wondering how everybody else got here." Well, I have to admit, that did occur to me a few times, and more recently. But the state legislature, it was a magnificent experience because it really formed my foundation for my whole approach to legislating in addition to my own personal experiences. I discovered that politics and public service were constructive endeavors. That in fact, after the election, my colleagues and I would put our party labels behind us and the campaigns and set about to focus on the issues that mattered to the people we were fortunate to represent. And that's the way it worked in the state legislature. But unfortunately, so much had changed. And I came to recognize that, obviously, in the final months of my service in the United States Senate. But something else also occurred, at the time in which, I made a decision to serve in the state legislature, and it was a personal one. I had to come to terms with my own circumstance of being a young widow. We didn't have children, but I started to think about other women and their circumstances, if they were to find themselves in similar ones. Those who had children, wondering what they did if they didn't have the means to support themselves as well as their families. And that realization really began to take shape when I was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1978. And I decided to go to bat for women because if we didn't, who would? And after all, there were only 16 women at that time in the U.S. House of Representatives out of 435. There was only one woman serving in the United States Senate. And so we were so drastically underrepresented that we could ill afford to be too partisan. So I joined the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues, as I mentioned earlier, which I did eventually co-chair for 11 years with Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, who was a Democrat. But interestingly enough, this caucus was formed by two congresswomen in the Congress before I was elected. One was a pro-choice Democrat, Congresswoman Liz Holtzman from New York, and a pro-life Republican, Margaret Heckler, who's a congresswoman from the state of Massachusetts. And we spoke as women first, not as Republicans and not as Democrats. And we decided that we would work on issues that were important to women and families. Because at that time, the laws were working against women. They were discriminating against women, not to mention the fact that they were not representing and reflecting the dual roles that women were facing at that time, in time of transition between work and family. And so we set about to change all that, because there was a time when pension benefits were canceled without the spouse's notification. And in this case, it was most oftentimes the woman would find out after the death of her husband. Child support enforcement was a woman's problem, wasn't a matter of law, wasn't a matter of concern, you know, for our society. Child care was extremely controversial. Family and medical leave was not the law of the land. In fact, it took us 7 long years. And then we discovered that women were excluded from clinical study trials, along with minorities. Study trials that were underwritten by the National Institutes of Health, underwritten, again, by the federal taxpayer. I mean, there were 2 major, studies. One was actually done on breast cancer, it omitted women. The other one was conducting on the effects of aspirin on cardiovascular diseases. And they included 22,000 white male physicians and not one woman. And so, obviously, they can't apply those treatments to women or to minorities if they're not included in the clinical study trials. So we asked the question, but why wouldn't you include women in clinical study trials? Well, they said they were concerned that their research would be endangered or affected by the women's reproductive system. We said, well, that's not going to change anytime soon. So could not the scientific and medical community accommodate it rather than overlooking it or ignoring it as an inconvenience? It sort of reminded me of the line from My Fair Lady, why can't a woman be more like a man? Because they obviously wanted uniformity. They didn't want any differences in order to conduct their clinical study trials. Well, we changed all that. We created an Office of Women's Health, which was my initiative, but we worked as a team in the House of Representatives along with Senator Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, who was also a trailblazer, and we got it done. And we passed a far-reaching initiative that, in fact, is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. But it also created the largest clinical study trial. It also created the largest clinical study trial, including 160,000 women that went for 15 years at a cost of more than $600 million. And to this day, it's producing life-saving discoveries from women. And there are many manifestations of these clinical study trials and many offshoots for further studies as a result. And we wanted to reverse the fact that women were the missing page in America's medical textbook. And so therefore, women's voices did make a difference. And the same was true on economic equality. The fact is, it wouldn't come as a surprise to you when I tell you that, economic equality pertained to men and not to women. Again, because those laws were not reflecting, women's role in the workplace as well. But we, again, introduced the Economic Equity Act that included a compilation of issues, and we had 2 titles, Women and Families, focusing all of the issues. And then we set about to introduce them separately because we figured that the scattershot approach would work. And there were very few of us in the House of Representatives, so we had to do everything we could to build alliances and coalitions. And as a result, we achieved an historic milestone in 1993 where 30 provisions became law. We focused on employment opportunities and economic opportunities, and we talked about dependent care tax credits that were important to working families between taking care of their children and their elderly parents. And the list went on. It went on for defense, it went on for health, it went on for childhood immunization, because we understood that all of these issues mattered fundamentally. And the same was true, frankly, when I was in the United States Senate. It was all about teamwork and collaboration. And I served on the Senate Finance Committee that has jurisdiction over 2/3 of the federal budget, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, health policy, economic policy, trade, and the list goes on. And when we were considering the largest tax cut in history, I teamed up with then Senator Blanche Lincoln from Arkansas, who's a Democrat on the committee, Democratic woman. And she and I introduced increasing the child tax credit and making it refundable for the first time. Because I decided, that it was important to make sure that we included working families in the equation of this tax cut. And you thought, well, it might have been easy. Well, it wasn't, needless to say. But ultimately, we prevailed. And it took, as a Republican, I would have been the deciding vote. And I'll get to all that in a moment. But the fact is, I was the deciding vote in the House-Senate conference when it was going to emerge as to whether or not that provision was going to be in there or not. And I said, well, it better be in there because I'm not voting for the bill without it. And they said, you mean it? And I said, absolutely, I mean it. And I leveraged my vote to make that policy because I thought it was so instrumental to the 37 million families and the 55 million children who would benefit from it. And as a and also in working with Senator Ted Kennedy on the genetic non-discrimination bill that ultimately became law. But that took us better part of 10 years. And it was about those who take genetic tests, oftentimes found themselves without insurance or losing their job because of engaging in genetic testing. And that came to my attention by one of my constituents who was a member of a family that had 9 members who were breast cancer survivors, including herself. And she wanted her daughter to take genetic tests. But her daughter was fearful of losing insurance or her job. And so as a result, I introduced this legislation with Senator Kennedy, and Louise Slaughter introduced it in the House of Representatives. But just to illustrate, how things are dramatically different today from this time. Senator Kennedy was the chair of the Health, Education, Labor Committee. And so he had jurisdiction over this legislation. So it's traditional for the chairman to report out the bill with his or her name first. And in this case, he deferred to me, and he put my name first, even though I was not even a member of the committee. And that's the way it used to work. Across party lines, deference to one another, irrespective of your political allegiances or philosophies. And ultimately, it was adopted and became law. And it was described as the first civil rights piece of legislation in the 21st century. So it was one in which I was very, very proud of, and to work with him. What do all of these initiatives have in common? None of them would have occurred had we been ensconced in our legislative foxholes. We had to work together, and we had to collaborate and to work across political lines. And yet, as we've progressed on issues of enormous importance to women. Why do I feel like every time I read the news or hear about it, that we've stepped back into a time warp, back to the future, revisiting issues in the 21st century. I always like to tell the story about 3 people who died and went to heaven. One was a doctor, one was a lawyer, and one was a woman politician. And they were met at the gates of heaven by St. Peter. And the doctor stepped forward and said, St. Peter, I've healed the sick and I've taken care of the young and old. I deserve to get in. St. Peter said, well, yes, you do, but you have to do one little thing. You have to spell God. And so he said, G-O-D, and in through the gates of heaven he went. The lawyer stepped forward. And the lawyer said, St. Peter, I have provided justice for my fellow man. I deserve to get in. And St. Peter said, well, you do, but there's just one small thing you have to do for me. Spell God. And he said, G-O-D, and in through the gates of heaven he went. And then the woman politician stepped forward, and she said, I've I've been running for office. I've represented my community, my state. I've had to overcome roadblocks and obstacles. It's been difficult. And St. Peter says, I know it has been a difficult time for you. You just have to do one small thing before you can get into the gates of heaven. She said, what is it? He said, spell Czechoslovakia. Well, we know it's easier today with the Czech Republic, right? But somehow you get the feeling that you have to spell Czechoslovakia over and over again. It's sort of like, repeating that fight, over and over again. But, in 2009, soon after President Obama became president, the very first bill he signed into law, and I was there for because I was one of the few Republican supporters and sponsors of the legislation, that was the Lilly Ledbetter Act. In fact, Lily was at the White House this week for talking about these very same issues that all of you are concerned about, and certainly I am. But she fought mightily and courageously for a number of years to fight the statute of limitations on equal pay pay lawsuits. And the fact is, there should not be a statute of limitations when it comes to discrimination. And here we are 51 years later after the Equal Pay Act, and we still have, yes, 77 cents on every dollar that a man earns. For African American women, it's 64 cents. For Latina women, it's 54 cents. So the point is there is that disparity. And what does that mean? It means that it is a contributing ingredient to the more defining elements for more American women. And that is, of course, the level of poverty. So yes, we have to change all that. And even on your studies in the Mecklenburg County and reviewing the disparities in wages, that represents about 24%, with a cumulative aggregate earnings of more than $1.9 billion. So that affects women, it affects families, it affects the communities, and affects the region, if not the state, and the entirety of our country when you consider the magnitude of these issues. So there's no question, and to paraphrase Robert Frost, that we have many miles to go before we can sleep for a fairer, more equitable, more just America, without question. But we're only going to be able to do it when we can do it together and taking those strides in collaboration. When I served in the United States Senate, the women senators used to get together, and still do, and I don't, but the current women senators still do, on a monthly basis for dinners. And I'm sure your own Senator Kay Hagan has mentioned those dinners to all of you. And by the way, she was a pleasure to work with because she worked across the political aisle. It wasn't about Republican issues, Democratic issues. It was about solutions to the problems. And that kind of spirit carried over in our monthly dinners that became this tradition. And we brought no agenda. We could talk about, our personal lives or our political lives or professional, what was happening, and just, sharing our thoughts and getting to know one another, which is obviously a rarity in today's environment in Washington. And so, sort of like Las Vegas, whatever was said there, stayed there. And there's never ever been a breach of disclosure. In fact, my last dinner was actually a reception that was held for both me and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, who was also retiring for the Senate. So they were holding this in our honor. But on the that very night, Kay and I were attending a Republican dinner being held by the Republican senators in our honor. The Democrats had a similar dinner the night before. It was customary at one time that these would be bipartisan dinners. So you could say goodbye to your colleagues, and they would be held in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. So it's not even bipartisan today to even say goodbye to your colleagues, and lamenting that as we did that night among us as women, as we were talking about it, because we weren't able to have, our own dinner, and thinking about the fact that, isn't that strange that we could not have had, our dinners together. But, those voices make a difference. They make a difference. And having 20 women in the United States Senate, yes, it makes a difference. It makes a difference. Yes, it makes a difference. because it also, creates fertile ground, for a more collegial, collaborative environment. It's not to say that we agree on everything and we're, opposite ends of the political spectrum, but we respect one another's differing views. We understand it. And we have active, willing listeners who are engaged and may well be a legislative partner on any issue that we have determined to be important. I think the reality is that these kind of bipartisan legislative partnerships are crucial to breaking down the political barriers and to maximizing the potential of governing institutions and our political system. I always recognized the fact, from my outset when I served in political office, and particularly when I was in the state legislature and where I learned my basic fundamentals, that if I had to be a legislative lone ranger, so be it. And when I served, as I said earlier, on the Senate Finance Committee, there were times in which I was the lone vote, the predictive vote, the swing vote, and my vote made a difference. And I know I used to give my Republican colleagues and leadership a little bit of heartburn from time to time when I was deciding that things should go in a different direction. So much so that the ranking Republican of the Finance Committee, Chuck Grassley, who was also the chair when we were in the majority, one day when I was in the Senate cloakroom, which is a room off the Senate chamber where you can make phone calls and have discussions and so forth, I was sitting in the phone booth about to make a call, and Senator Grassley comes up to me and he puts out his hand, he opens it up, and in the palm of his hand was sitting some pills. He said, "Do you see these, Olympia?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You're the reason I take these." And I said, "Well, geez, I'm sorry, Senator Grassley, I'm making life so difficult." Well, not long thereafter, Senator Grassley became the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, and Senator Orrin Hatch succeeded him. So one day it occurred to me to ask Senator Hatch what happened to those pills. And so I did. I said, "Well, Senator Grassley, what'd you do with those pills?" He says, "I gave them to Senator Hatch." So in any event, it's important that you have bipartisan collaborations and that you work across the aisle. Because if you think about it, of all the landmark initiatives that occurred in the 20th century, whether it's Social Security or Medicare, the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act, a welfare reform, the fact of the matter is none of which would have occurred. None of which would have occurred or been woven in the fabric of our country had they been enacted along partisan lines. But they enjoyed broad bipartisan support, which made all the difference. But today, we are weaving a different kind of tapestry, that is impeding our ability to solve the problems of this great nation. And so bipartisan partnerships, as we've witnessed in Washington, are as rare as solar eclipses, if not Halley's Comets. And that's what we have to change, because we have to overcome this political crisis and this gridlock so that we can create economic equality and opportunity for all Americans. It was underscored as well with your reports, the recently published Shriver report that discussed the level of poverty among women. And in the Shriver report, in which I'm on the advisory board, it indicated that women, 2/3 of women, are primary co-breadwinners of their families. And they represent half the workforce, and yet 1 in 3 women live at or near the brink of poverty. That is patently unacceptable. As Maria Shriver said, women feel powerless and invisible, but also hopeless, because they see their elected officials not focusing on the policies that makes it work for them and to help them work and to make their lives more manageable. And you see it today in the economic growth numbers, you see it in the lackluster job creation number. It isn't as good as it gets. It should be better. But the abrogation of leadership in Washington has led us to this tipping point because of Congress's inaction and inertia on issues that are important, such as regulatory reform, or tax reform, or looking at our debt, passing budgets, doing the basic fundamental and responsible things when it comes to the fiscal issues facing this country. As Janet Yellen, who's now focusing on Main Street, I said, finally, somebody is focusing on Main Street, because that's what it needs to be all about. and talking about that there are people behind those staggering numbers, as she mentioned, and those statistics. And she's absolutely right, because there is a big detachment between Main Street and Washington. And that's why we have to restore the integrity of the process in Washington, D.C. that makes it work for everyone and for the greater good of this country. People ask me every day, well, why is it so polarizing? Why is it so difficult to achieve bipartisan solutions? Well, the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer, unfortunately. But some statistics illustrate how big the divide is that is disconcerting. In 1987, there were 57 senators who represented states, and they were of one party, but their states voted for the presidential candidate of the other party. Today, there are only 21 senators who are in that category. And the U.S. House of Representatives, John Howard, wrote in the New York Times recently that back in 1986, there were 45% of the U.S. House of Representatives who had congressional districts where the member of Congress was of one party, but their districts voted for the presidential candidate of the other party. Today, it's only 6%, only about 25 seats. And if you, depending on which study you look at, in terms of competitive seats in the House of Representatives, according to Nate Silver, it could be as few as 35. Fair Vote Study is saying 21 out of 435 that could be competitive. National Journal, a highly respected publication on Capitol Hill, has been conducting a voting trend analysis of members of Congress in both the House and Senate since 1982. And that year, they determined there were 58 senators who came between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. Today, for the third year, actually it's the fourth year in a row, the fifth time ever, based on their recent release of a few weeks ago, there are 0 senators who come into that category. 0. So there's no Democratic senator who's more conservative than a Republican. There's no Republican who's more liberal than a Democrat. In the House of Representatives in 1982, there were 344 who, would cross the aisle on a regular basis. Today, there are only 4 out of 435. But that just is illustrative of the divide that has occurred and how polarizing it is. And according to the National Journal, as they stated, that the ideological sorting by party has virtually been complete. That has been taking place over the last 3 decades, but virtually has been complete. So it's no wonder then that according to 3 political scientists, that they determined this is the highest level of polarization since the end of Reconstruction in 1879. So thinking about 135 years, we're at the most polarizing point, in our history. I mean, I know some people say, well, it was worse in the 1800s. We had duels and brawls and canings. Well, is that the standard by which we want to measure the United States Senate? For some, yes, that's probably true. But one of the political scientists said, the polarization is so off the charts that they can't even measure any further increases. So no wonder then, it's the least productive Congress. Last Congress was the least productive, but this one is about to surpass it. The last Congress was described as a do-nothing Congress. I mean, it was compared to the 1947 Congress, which was a do-nothing Congress. And yet they passed 906 bills, and the last Congress passed 283. So you think about the difference. And so President Truman thought he had headaches then. I mean, so the point is, it's not working. It's not to say that you have to have an abundance of legislation. It's not the point. If they were doing the things they needed to do, then you could say, well, you don't need that much. But they're not even doing the small things, let alone the large things. And so that's why it all has to change. So it's no wonder then there's all-time public disapproval. When I left the United States Senate, our approval rating was about 10%, and one of my former colleagues said, well, who exactly is that 10% that thinks that Congress is doing a good job? Even root canals were more popular and still are. I mean, so it's a tragedy, that they're surrounded by all this history but not inspired by it, not working together and doing what's important. I often threaten to go to the floor and conduct a refresher course on how a bill becomes law because we've jettisoned the legislative process in Washington. I mean, that's the unfortunate part. You don't have an amendment process. You don't have the regular order that you hear about today, which means the normal course of legislative business, introducing a bill, have it go to committee, sort it through, build support. That's where you have debates, send it to the floor of the Senate, have your amendments, bringing both sides together. Those amendments are the bridge. But it's not happening. That's why, we're on the road to nowhere these days, because you don't have both sides being able to bring, the differences into an amendment to reconcile, the different positions and views. So in the United States Senate, you get each side offering their views, and if they don't prevail, they take it to the next election, because it's all about the next election. Unlike when I first started my legislative career, is that, we put that behind us, and we worked on issues important to the future of this country. So the question is, and it brings us to today, what do we do about it? Well, we are a representative democracy. If we value bipartisanship, if we value consensus building and compromise, we will get it. I often think of a comment that was made by a former colleague of mine, the former senator from Wyoming, Alan Simpson, who happens to be a friend of Chancellor Dubois and Lisa's. He once said, if you can't learn to compromise on issues without compromising your principles, then you should not go to Congress, and you shouldn't get married. But the point is, there's no other way. You have to talk to the other side. You have to respect their views, because you're not going to get 100% of what you want. So we're a representative democracy. If we demand it, we'll get it. Reward those who are willing to cross the political aisle, and penalize those who don't. And that's why I've joined the Bipartisan Policy Center, where I'm co-chairing a commission on political reform. We will be issuing recommendations on how we can make congressional reforms, political reforms, and how we encourage and promote public service. And we plan to implement them, not just have some report gathering dust on a table. We want to launch initiatives. We should have independent redistricting commissions, frankly, to break up these homogeneous political districts. We should have open primaries, allow independents to be voting in primaries, another way of muting and diluting the ideological forces that have taken hold in these primaries. It's a question of having more center-right and center-left candidates that would emerge from primaries, but it's more far-right and far-left. And frankly, it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. It's about solving problems at the end of the day, and not just taking it to the next election. It's not about just the fight, and that's what's not happening. And we should have 5-day work weeks in Washington. And what I mean by that is that, there are times in which they just got to concentrate on the legislative business of the nation. I mean, these are very complex issues. These are difficult times. And the schedule routinely was, and still is, in the United States Senate, well, you come in at 5:30, that's a bed check vote. By Thursday, they're smelling jet fumes, it's time to leave. And it's important to go home to your constituents, and I did all the time. But you should have some time in Washington, have 3 weeks on, 1 week off, or go home Friday nights and come back Sunday nights or, Monday morning. But we have to focus on the issues that matter to the country. You have to be there and, hey, get to know your colleagues. Get to know one another. It makes a huge difference, and it's important to the country. So that works, and they should get to know one another. But more than anything else, it's about speaking up, because silence is not golden. Do not underestimate the value and the importance and the impact of your voice. As the late Senator Warren Rudman once said, politics is too important to be left to the politician. He couldn't have been more right. Last year when there were all these cutbacks due to the automatic cuts, and there was a slowdown of thousands of flights across the country because of the reduction in the number of air traffic controllers. And so Congress started to think about it, because they were going on recess. That was the only thing that was predictable, by the way, were recesses. They realized they'd be getting on planes, idling planes on the tarmac with angry constituents, and the pilot coming over the intercom saying, well, this is due to congressional budget cuts. Well, they turned that around in nanoseconds, because they realized that they had to respond quickly. That's the point, is making an impact in real time as well as in elections. And you have the power of the social media, and you have the power of technology to create online communities instantaneously and effectively, and it's a message multiplier. Use it as those who have fanned the flames of polarization, because frankly the forces of division are well organized, they're united. And so we have to weigh in, you know, middle America has to weigh in, because I can tell you in my travels, the majority of Americans want their government to work at the end of the day, and it needs to work for all of us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll take some questions. I know it's... Yes.
With the recent defeat of equal pay again in Congress, can you possibly explain why there's so much negative voting for equal pay?
Well, you know, it's unfortunate because I know this issue came up as well when I was there. And I had some difficulties with some of the language in that particular bill, which I think was the same as true that occurred this week. And this is the unfortunate dimension of how the legislative process is not working in the Senate, because it is the greatest deliberative body on earth. Amendments used to be, you know, part of the tradition, you know, of offering amendments to reconcile those differences. And in this case, there was a real question of open-ended lawsuits in the way it was defined on punitive and compensatory damages and the impact it would have. And we were unable to offer an amendment, and I think that that was true this time. So it really isn't an either-or, but it's all part of the political system, and it happens on both sides. They offer one position on one end of the spectrum or another to appeal to their political bases or ideological interests rather than to the broader interests of the American people. So frankly, I think that that can get done with a few adjustments in that legislation. In fact, at the time, I was approached by some of the authors early on in that Congress, and I said, you know, I think we could get it done, but not to leave, you know, business, especially small businesses, subjected, you know, to punitive lawsuits. And it was open-ended because of the way they had changed the legislation. But I think it could happen. You know, if they're willing to work together to bridge the divide, and that's what these amendments are all about, rather than just using it as a political issue and a political weapon. And that's what's happened to so many of the issues that are facing this country. It's always about taking it to the next election. You know, if you fuel the divide, you know, it's big business today, frankly. You know, a lot of people are making a lot of money to keep it divided, to keep the political system polarized. Because if you solve the problem, they wouldn't have anything to talk about. They wouldn't have their millions to spend on in these third-party ads. You know, but that's what's happened. And so that they can score a political point, get the opponents on record, get the opposition on record, and then take it to the next election enshrined in a 30-second soundbite. So it's all about messaging. Messaging is little talking points. I used to say to my side, you know, can we get beyond the 3 talking points, it's good for America, bad for America, whatever, and get into the substance, get into the facts? Because that's what we've gotten away from in the legislative process. That's what's changed, and that's why we have to get back to restoring some normalcy into the legislative process. And there are so many people there who want to make it work. And I think that the leadership has to allow them to make it work and let them sort out the issues as we customarily were able to do. Yes, yes.
Take one more question.
Yes.
First, thank you, Senator, for being here. Your words have been very, very enlightening. I asked, do you think it's a moderate could come in and actually get elected? Because do you think it's the financial support and why you choose to be either a Republican or a Democrat based on your financial support from your party?
Well, you have to, I mean, I raised my money, not necessarily from all my party, that's for sure. I mean, I traveled the country. And, you know, there was a time even before when I was running for re-election and I was working to build moderate Republican groups within the Republican Party, you know, talking about the absence of, you know, moderates and centrists. You know, you can be a conservative and be a centrist in a lot of ways. It's about practicality here, you know, and reflecting, you know, solutions to the everyday problems that people are facing in their lives. And I happen to believe that if we support people, you know, politically and financially and organizationally, we'll restore some sensibility, you know, and govern from what I call the sensible center, because that's where most Americans are. And it's just, if you think about it, it's more the fringes that have taken over. You know, I say to young people today, you're going to live to your 125, at least according to some, you know, medical research. I mean, do you want them controlling, the fringes controlling your future and the destiny of this nation without having a voice or contributing that voice? So yes, we can make a difference. But if we sit on the sidelines and observe what's happening, if we decide that we can't make a difference, which we can make a difference, that's problematic. We have to weigh in and we have to engage. Yes, with our money, the contributions, with our support, with our vocal advocacy. One of the most disturbing things that, you know, I read last fall in the aftermath of the 16-day shutdown was an article that appeared in the Politico newspaper, Capitol Hill newspaper. And the title of it was something to the effect, the pre-shutdown assessments that didn't pan out. And one of which was the fact that lawmakers were surprised there was no public backlash to that 16-day shutdown. So there was no vocal outcry. And so we can contribute, you know, we can contribute in myriad ways. During the year, you can make them accountable through social media, in real time, and also in elections. You know, when elections come around, and they're coming very quickly, you can demand accountability on the part of those who are running and say, what are you going to do to make your government work? Because that is as much of an issue as anything else. Because if the government doesn't work, you can't get your problem solved. We can't get the country's problem solved. If you can't move legislation forward in the issues that matter to this country, you can't move the country forward. It's as simple as that. And that's why we've come to a standstill. This isn't our maximum potential as America. Absolutely not. I don't want you to settle for less, because when you can get more and for what we stand, and that's why we have to weigh in. And when there's a presidential election, demand accountability from the presidential candidates that are running. What are you going to do to make your branch of government work with the other? And vice versa. Because you cannot have your government working in parallel universes between the legislative and executive branch. It just doesn't work that way. And we've got to come back to some sensibility and pragmatism, but for the good of the country, for the entire United States of America. There's a reason why we are the United States of America. That's how we were founded. So, to answer your question, yes, moderates can. No more, you know, than anybody else. We can get elected and get centrists because people want that. And they understand now the value and the role, you know, of those who are willing to work across the political aisle. Because it makes no sense. There's no other sphere of life where you get 100% of what you want. None. And if there is, let me know about it. But there isn't. So we have to work with the other side, and we have to respect differing opinions. And we have to listen to one another to make it work. We have to do that personally in our lives, and we have to do it professionally. And that's what it's all about. You're doing it. I'm sort of preaching to the choir here. But I want you to take the message out beyond, because it can make a difference. That's why I left the Senate, because I realized if I was going to contribute in any way, it's best to tell people how it did work, how it can work, and how we can make it work again. Thank you.